So how do state adversaries and hacktivists today align to break into our OT or ICS environments, critical infrastructure, to do things like turn off power or have some type of impact to clean water? How does that happen? And more importantly, how can we protect against those types of attacks? It's a big part about what we're going to cover in this video. So let's go ahead and jump right in. So originally, this was my idea to put together a couple of talks for the ICS village at DEF CON. And I had two talks. And one was the greatest ICS OT cybersecurity love story. And then the other one was the worst ICS OT cybersecurity love story, which we're going to talk about here. And ideally, there's a conversation to be had about, ultimately keeping attackers out of OT environments. So it really comes down to making sure that OT or ICS environments are safe. If you're not familiar with this image, this is actually the result of a group of cyber attacks from a group called the Cyber Avengers. And the Cyber Avengers, they're a Iranian-linked hacktivist group. And they were targeting these combination control systems that were part PLC, they're part HMI. And so you have the PLC functionality to run an environment or a physical process, and then you would have the HMI or the GUI screen to be able to see what was going on in the environment. Because these devices were made by a company named Unitronics, and they were made in Israel, that's why they were being targeted by the Cyber Avengers, because of their alignment with the Iranian interest. And so why I like to talk about this instance is when you look at the hacktivist activity, right? And most of these systems were found exposed directly to the internet with default passwords, right? Where we're making it too easy for the attackers to be able to get in, to be able to essentially wipe the PLC and then replace the screen on the HMI with a red screen to say whatever we want. Now, the vast majority of the environments that were hit, they're actually water treatment facilities. Now, almost all of them were able to fall back to manual operations, right? So we fall off of control system or automated control and we go back to manual operations. So all of our customers still get clean water in their homes. There was an instance, though, in Ireland where 160 people lost water for 2 days. So there was an impact. Was it a huge impact? No, but there's always that if. Because next time it could be 160,000 people. Or maybe instead of 2 days, it's for 2 weeks or 2 months. And so the impact only continues to grow. In this case, that it was a hacktivist attack, and usually hacktivists are associated with what I call high frequency. So there's a lot of these different types of attacks. But when they occur, even when they're successful, the impact is low. So again, for hacktivists, think high frequency but low impact. All these environments that were hit, except for the one in Ireland, there really was no impact other than they had to fall back to manual operations for a little bit. And then someone had to restore the PLC, the HMI, and the programming, and they were back up and running in probably 3-4 hours in most cases. So when I did want to highlight the greatest OT ICS cybersecurity love story, this is where it goes back to looking at the movie Hackers, which probably if you're under 30, you might not have ever even heard of, let alone seen. But it was actually Angelina Jolie's second movie. It came out in 1995. And where I was really coming from was talking about the movie. And this is 15 years before Stuxnet came out. But it was way ahead of its time in looking at how attackers could actually make changes to systems and processes in the real world. So in the very beginning of the movie, Johnny Lee Miller, the blonde guy in the middle, plays a hacker kid called Crash Override and also Zero Cool. And so the first thing he does when he and his mother move to New York is he gets on his modem, he dials into a television station, and he takes over essentially the control system that moves the robotic arm that changes the tapes at a television station. So it literally changed what the station was showing on the television. And so he could watch The Outer Limits, which is what he wanted to watch. And there's some scenarios where he breaks into the fire control system at the school and sets off the fire sprinklers. That's a little far-fetched. That one you probably wouldn't be able to do through a computer interface. At least it shouldn't be. Right? There's an instance at the very end where they actually took over the building management system and skyscrapers in New York City where they could spell out their names, crash and burn. And then a lot of the movie actually revolved around this virus that was set to capsize these large oil shipping or oil container ships. And when you think about that's a very real concern today when we talk about maritime OT or ICS cybersecurity. And so a lot of these attacks actually are very realistic. And we see hints of these in other types of attacks that have occurred over the years. So my original talk was really about, the movie and it's kind of being ahead of its time, and at the same time, how we defend OT cyber environments. Again, if we look at the timeline of major or main OT cyber events over time, you can see again, hackers was in 1995, way ahead of any the significant OT incidents that we've actually had. I just wanted to take a minute to thank our sponsor for this video, UTSI. UTSI really focuses on taking the buzzwordiness out of AI, using it to protect OT and ICS, critical infrastructure environments. I've really appreciated the approach, right, to keep it practical, to act as that force multiplier that we see it as, but also taking out the fluff. And they've actually created an ecosystem using some of the AI platforms that do keep it practical, that do take out the marketing fluff to help you be more secure, like creating a digital twin of your environment, using it to be able to find vulnerabilities, the various risks in your environment. And then taking all of that to be able to create realistic incident response scenarios to make your team that more efficient in responding if you were to have a breach. So again, I just wanted to take a moment to thank our friends at UTSI for sponsoring this video and ask you to check them out at their website at utsi.com. What I was also trying to highlight with this timeline is that we can see that there were only a few major significant incidents in the OT world up until 2021, where we had the Colonial Pipeline breach. After the Colonial Pipeline breach, that's where not only did a lot of asset owners and operators understand that, we actually need to do something for cybersecurity, protect our environments, especially in critical infrastructure. But attackers also understood, hey, there's this thing out there called OT, and we can target it and we can make money. And so that's why since 2021, we've just seen a continued steady flow, if not an increase in attacks that are targeting either OT environments or at least the IT environments that they're connected to, which ultimately can still impact OT operations. And so that was a big part of that talk. But it really leads into this question of, so where are we today? And we're just talking about this hacktivist attack that was only about a year and a half ago at this point, where we saw all of these water treatment facilities going down and not being able to supply clean water without manual operations. And that one impact to where 160 people in Ireland lost water for 2 days. So where are we? And at the time of this recording, it's basically the middle of 2025. So every year, Dragos, which most people will consider the largest kind of OT ICS cybersecurity firm out there, and a big part of what they focus on is things like threat intelligence, incident response, network security monitoring, penetration testing. And every year they put out their year in review report. Now, this is like the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report, if you come more from the IT side of the house and are familiar with that, right? They look at all the known incidents the previous year, plus all the work that they do with their own clients. And I'd say most Dragos clients are some of the largest, more mature OT or ICS organizations that are out there. They take all that information, in this case, looking at all of those incidents and all the environments that they were in back in 2024 throughout the year, and putting numbers around the report to help us better understand not only what's happening out there, but how do we better protect our environments. And so there was the metrics that probably a lot of people were already expecting, because we see a continued increase in ransomware year after year. And that's ransomware targeting either, again, OT directly, or at least the IT networks that OT is connected to, which could impact OT operations. You see the number of ransomware groups that Dragos is tracking is increasing, and that the majority of attacks against OT are targeting manufacturing, which I think makes sense because there's only so many power plants and there's only so many water treatment facilities, and there's limited numbers of those types of OT or ICS environments. But manufacturing is everywhere. I can throw a rock out my window and hit probably a dozen manufacturing plants from where I live. And so I think that's a lot of, again, probably expected numbers and what we hear about in the news. But there was a lot of other interesting tidbits that came out of the report. Like, you could see that out of all the environments that Dragos had worked in that previous year, all throughout 2024, they found that 65% of those organizations had unsecure remote conditions. I know they said insecure. Remember, people are insecure, computers are unsecure. But that means 65% of OT organizations had essentially weak architecture around remote access, where an attacker could more than likely get into the OT environment fairly easily. And if that wasn't enough, then when I saw this one, it was like, well, 45% of the customers that use the Dragos network security monitoring service were actually shown to have active SSH connections from the OT network with an IP address on the internet. And while perhaps some of that was configured by maybe the asset owners or the operators thinking for a legitimate purpose, maybe like for remote access and remote control into the plant, I would assume the majority of that is actually some type of an attacker having access to the environment from over the internet through some type of command and control channel. Obviously, that's not something that we want to see. And those are some really fascinating numbers for me. Now, there's another item that really caught my attention, and this was not, there weren't any, numbers per se, right? There weren't any, metrics that jumped off the page, but it was this idea where there's now essential evidence that shows direct links between hacktivist groups and state adversaries revolving around the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. And so when you see CARR, or the Cyber Army of Russia Reborn, that's a hacktivist group aligned with Russian state interests. And now we can see how they are aligned with groups like Sandworm, one of the most notorious, if the most publicly notorious ICS OT cybersecurity or cyber attack groups out there that were responsible for attacks like taking off the power in the Ukraine in 2015 and in 2016. And many others, like NotPetya, which did billions of dollars of damage around the world. And so I thought it was really fascinating, right, that we had now hacktivists and state adversaries where they're actually starting to work together. Now, some of that is that the state adversaries kind of hiding behind the hacktivists, and that's always been suspected probably for quite a while, even before the current Russian-Ukrainian war. But as more evidence comes out, and this is where you start thinking of, with hacktivists, we have, like we mentioned earlier, there's this high frequency of attacks, right? There's lots of attacks generated by hacktivists, whereas state adversaries, those attacks are very, very, very rare to happen. And at the same time, when hacktivists attack, and we think of those Unitronics devices that were hacked and they put up the red screen saying you've been hacked, right? The impact of hacktivists is very, very low. So even when they're successful, they do very little to no damage, typically. The state adversaries, when they get in and they have an impact, then there's a true impact. And that's really the concern when we start looking at them merging together. So are we starting to go to this world where it's high volume and high impact? Are we starting to at least maybe slowly make that transition? And so that's where I started to go down the worst ICS OT love story ever. You're right, when we talk about looking at hacktivist and state adversaries coming together and aligning their forces. And so I'd actually pitched this and wanted to talk about this at S4 next year. And if you're not familiar, S4 is considered the largest OT ICS cybersecurity conference in the world. It's in Florida every year. And so I was talking with Dale Peterson, the gentleman that runs the conference, and he does a really great job of, he'll talk with people that have submitted to talk at the conference and walk through their proposals and ask questions. And at the end of the day, he talked about, well, why does it matter? Like, okay, you want to come talk about this, but why does it really matter that activists and state adversaries are aligning and you want to create this converged actor framework to help people track this type of activity and be aware of it? So why does it matter? Which is really interesting because I'm usually seen as the one that's practical. And he was asking this question. I'm like, that is a really good question. Because a lot of times, you can think, and I try to take geopolitical considerations out of the cyber security conversations. That's becoming harder and harder to do these days. because of the different conflicts that we see around the world. And that, the more significant attacks in the OT world or in the control system space have been because of geopolitical conflict. There's this idea, sure, that the traditional threat model isn't always applying 100% of the time, right? We need to definitely keep an eye out where state adversaries and hacktivists and potentially ransomware group others or other types of attackers are starting to align. And as we mentioned earlier, we've seen instances where state adversaries like Sandworm are hiding their activity behind hacktivist activity. So you might see kind of a lot of noisy traffic or attacks, and the state adversary is slipping in through all that noise and probably never detected. And then there's this idea of, well, attribution. A lot of people love attribution. There's that part of me that, growing up and watching James Bond or Jason Bourne, right, or anything spy related, right? It's fascinating, like to read a book like Sandworm, or to hear about the different governments and developing their tools and breaking into an environment and launching their mission and watching if their mission fails or succeeds, right? And what the impact is. There's that spy aspect that is very fascinating to me. But at the same time, does it ultimately matter where the attacker is coming from? And so that's why I say attribution. At the end of the day, for me, it doesn't matter. If you're on my network or a network of one of my clients, I don't care who you are. I just want you gone. If you're not on the network, you can't have an impact. It's as easy as that. I don't care if you're Russia, China, the US, whoever. If you're not on the network, you can't have an impact. Are there some advantages for understanding the attacker and their mission and why they're trying to break into your environment? Sure. But how helpful is that going to be? And I've been in more than a few incident response cases against state adversaries and ransomware groups and everything in between. Does it help? Yeah, it adds a little color to the conversation and maybe gives you a little bit better understanding of your adversary, but is it helping you defend your environment any better? Is it helping you to make sure that the attacker is completely out of the environment and that you can remove them and get back into operating successfully? Again, does it help? Yeah, a little, but can do the same job without that information? I would argue yes. So at the end of the day, when it comes to attribution, I don't care who you are, where you're coming from, what you want. I just want you off the network. And so I went ahead and shifted the attack. Really, should have named it. We make it too easy for attackers to get into OT or ICS environments these days. And there's a lot of reasons. A lot of that's down to awareness and education. There's not a lot of awareness or educational material out there that's accessible for people. That's why I post on LinkedIn and I post on YouTube, to help people understand the need for OT cybersecurity and how to defend, right? How do we build our programs? And it doesn't have to be complicated. It doesn't have to be complex. And it doesn't have to be as expensive as people often think either. So awareness and education, that's definitely one part to it. Others, environments are just learning or realizing they need to do something about OT cybersecurity. And if that's the case, they don't have the budget right now. They haven't been planning to spend money on OT cybersecurity. So those are things that we're just starting to see being planned for majority of environments out there. So when I start looking at 65% of the organizations out there, at least the ones that Dragos assessed through 2024, had unsecure remote access architecture that could easily or fairly easily be broken into. Or 45% of their customers had active SSH connections with the outside world, which not all of those are going to be for a legitimate purpose. We start to wonder. And so that's why, it's not about, again, it really goes back to education and awareness. Because there is a big discrepancy in environment in the OT world and who can and who can't afford cybersecurity. In my day job, I get to work with some of the world's largest companies and the largest OT or ICS environments like Shell and Saudi Aramco and BP. And they invest significant resources into OT cybersecurity and have some of the strongest, more mature programs in the world. But there's only so many Shells and Saudi Aramcos and BPs, right? Those are very few and far between. The majority, by far, of OT environments out there, they're small to maybe medium-sized shops. Again, that didn't even realize up to recently they needed to even do something about OT cybersecurity. And now that we're starting to realize we need to do something about OT cybersecurity, it's like, well, where do we get started? So that's where I came up with my 5 controls that I suggest any OT environment starts with. Because it doesn't matter how big or how small, this is where you want to start. And there are other controls out there we can talk about, like having a risk assessment performed or doing network security monitoring, which those are all great things and part of a world-class OT cybersecurity program. But we have to remember that most OT environments aren't going to be able to afford somebody to come in and do a risk assessment. They're not going to have the staff or the resources to implement network security monitoring. The vast majority of OT environments globally. This is something that Rob Lee at Dragos, he's the CEO and founder of Dragos, and one of the, considered by many, one of the thought leaders in OT cybersecurity. Right? It says that only about 5% of OT environments globally actually does network security monitoring. And it's not necessarily because that they don't know they should be doing it. It's even if they know they should be doing it, they don't have the resources to, and they never will. So what can we do in every environment? And you can actually significantly reduce your risk by doing these 5 things. Again, then as time progresses and your program matures, right, we can continue to get better just day by day a little bit. We talk about that basic approach. So look at backup and recovery. And this is where I go back and thinking about that red screen and that image that we saw. That was actually taken by a gentleman that ran a brewery just outside of Chicago. And he walked in when the brewery had gone down and saw this big red screen. Now he knew he had actually connected the system to the internet because that's what his boss wanted to do. They wanted to be able to watch the screen from home. And he knew that was actually a bad idea. So he firewalled it off internally so it couldn't touch or talk to any other systems, which was great. It didn't prevent that from happening though. They said it went down. He was prepared for it to happen. And so he was able to restore everything in 3 or 4 hours. So think, just like in the IT world, when we talk about it, it's not a question of if, but it's a question of when. Your OT environment is going to get compromised. It might be today, it could be tomorrow, it could be in 10 years or somewhere in between. But the idea is that you're going to get compromised. So are you able to get back up and running as safely and quickly as possible when it does? So backup and recovery is key. Asset management, idea there is, do we understand everything that's in our environment? We can't protect what we don't know we have, especially if we're not doing things like network security monitoring, which again, a lot of environments can't afford. So we have to understand, we have to build out what they call the asset register or an asset inventory to understand, what type of control systems and other machines like Windows servers and laptops we have in the environment. So we can make sure that we're protecting those over time. And that helps in things like incident response and vulnerability management. So understanding what's in the environment is key. I usually like to start with secure network architecture, but it didn't fit the acronym very well. This used to be SOBIC, but I thought BASIC was better. Because we at least need some type of separation, usually with a firewall, between IT and OT. And so that way we can limit the traffic, we can limit the paths an attacker can use to move from IT to OT. Because the number one way attackers get into the OT environment is through IT. The problem is that lends itself to this IT versus OT mentality, which puts so many different teams at each other's throats, or just makes it so they don't talk to each other. And if that's happening, the attackers are winning. So we have to make sure IT and OT are working together. It's just a fact that, most attackers do come through IT, not necessarily on any fault of IT's. We have to work together to secure IT and OT. And then we can look at further segmenting the OT network to, if an attacker got in the environment, we can slow them down to where we can ideally, hopefully, catch them before they do any damage. Though admittedly, that is hard to do without network security monitoring. There's incident response planning, and there's a lot that's in there. But if anything, right, are we actually practicing what we would do in the event of an incident? Are our team members ready to respond as quickly and safely and efficiently as possible? Do we even know, can we disconnect IT and OT from each other in an incident? Would we even know how to? If I ran into the data center, would I know which cabinet to go into and which wire to pull to disconnect IT from OT? And if we do that, can we do that safely? Have we talked with engineering and the folks running the plant to understand, can we disconnect IT and OT without any safety issues? Would it impact operational availability? Is there anything we need to do to shut this plant safely down before we disconnect the two? And so those are all things we have to plan ahead, because again, it's not a question of if, it's only a question of when. And then vulnerability management in the OT world is very different than in IT. Remember, IT, patch comes out, there's a new vulnerability, right? The patch is there, we're going to start pushing that out pretty quickly, almost right away. Maybe with a little testing, but usually pushing it out right away. When we get a new patch or find a new vulnerability in OT, we have to look at it and understand, what does it really mean in our environment? We need to talk with the folks in engineering and that run the plant to understand, well, what does this vulnerability mean on this one system and where it sits on the network and what it's responsible for in the plant? Because a lot of times we might not actually even need to do anything about it. Or if we do, or if it does have an impact potentially to safety or operational availability, that's something we're going to want to have to get addressed. And so we need to work with the people that operate the plant to coordinate that remediation. And hopefully we don't have to wait for the next change window in 3 or 4 years. But that's the idea of the basic approach. So when we talk about, and I know this coming up, I kind of start to get into more of this. People might think I'm starting to use the fear and the uncertainty and doubt, and that's not the intent of this talk. Because again, you can master those 5 fundamentals to greatly reduce your risk. But as I kind of wind down, I do like to highlight the FrostyGoop incident. And you see this is January 2024, where the Russians had gone in to 600 apartment buildings in the Ukraine and turned off heating for 2 days in the middle of winter with sub-zero temperatures outside. Again, it's not 600 apartments, but 600 apartment buildings. This is a very simple attack done with a very simple piece of malware that you can recreate. And I do this in my classes. You can recreate this piece of malware in 5 minutes or less using ChatGPT and the research that Dragos released. And here's part of the original report that had released. And here they show a Wireshark capture of the tool would connect to this controller responsible for heating and read different values from over Modbus, what they call registers. And then it would actually make changes. It can actually make changes to those registers. And here's actually, if you look at the manufacturer of those devices, it's actually a manufacturer called ENCO, E-N-C-O. You can see here's the apartment building, and we have all the sensors that are spread throughout the apartment building to understand, right, how hot, how cold, right, what's the temperature throughout the environment. And so all of that information is fed into this controller down here. And the controllers are responsible for essentially turning the heating on and off. And you can see that the apartment managers have access to be able to interact with that controller, right, through a web interface. But also, if an attacker gets on the network, they can interact with that controller through, there's telnet available, and that controller also uses Modbus. And Modbus is an unauthenticated OT or ICS protocol. Remember, unauthenticated means that you never ask for a username, it never asks you for a password. You can connect to it and you can just issue commands. And in this case, they issued commands in order to be able to turn off the heating for 600 apartment buildings. I think it just took the people that were responsible for those buildings 2 days to figure out what was going on before they could get the heating back on. And here's a quick look at what it would look like. And this is the tool that I wrote, a version of FrostyGoop called Snow Crash. Snow Crash is one of my favorite books of all times. It's a hacking fiction book, basically, in the future. It's a very cyberpunk. And FrostyGoop, a lot of people kind of laugh at the name. And so I called it Snow Crash, right? And this is a Python script. Sure, FrostyGoop was written in Go and compiled to an exe called modbus.exe, right? But it works the same way. You specify an IP address that it would connect to. Here we're going to say we're going to change this register so that the value changes to 20. So maybe that's a 20 to be able to turn the heating off for these apartment buildings. And then in this case, you can even say we read the value after the fact just to make sure that the change actually went into effect. But again, you can actually rewrite this tool using the Dragos research, using ChatGPT in 5 minutes or less. It looks a little weird at first, but once you play for it, maybe play with it for an hour or two, even if you're brand new to OT cybersecurity, you can master it pretty quickly. And interestingly enough, if you go to Shodan and look for ENCO, remember the manufacturer of these devices, now you get a lot of hits back, or I should say, well, there's 711 systems that show that string ENCO. It doesn't mean it's these specific assets. But I do find it interesting when I look at this list, Ukraine is number 3. And so if we click on Ukraine, we can actually find a number of those assets. And then a number of those assets actually not only have Telnet exposed, but they have TCP 502 exposed. 502 is the port for Modbus. So we have Telnet on TCP 23, and we have TCP 502 for Modbus. And that's what allows us to interact with the system and make changes. Now this is what the telnet menu looks like if you connect. And you can go into the different options, and it looks like you don't need a password even for the menu unless you're going to configure a port or reset the device based off of what it looks like. And here's the menu if you want to look at the what they call the I/O, or the input output, how we send and receive information with the control system itself. But then again, I can use a tool that I recreate in ChatGPT to be able to connect to this controller over Modbus where I'm never asked for a username and password, and I can set that value to 20 to turn off the heating. It doesn't get much easier than that. We make it too easy for attackers these days. And again, I understand. I'm not trying to jump on anybody. Again, it's primarily due to lack of awareness and education over the years. Again, that's why we're here. That's why I post on LinkedIn, and that's why I post on YouTube. But when you think of where we're building to, again, this is not meant to be like the fear and uncertainty and doubt slide, but I guess in a way it is. But where this comes from, so Rob Lee, we were talking earlier, who's the co-founder and CEO of Dragos, he actually did our keynote address at B.A.S.I.c.s ICS this year. And he talked about a potential, let's say, Trisis version 2 incident. Now, if you're not familiar with Trisis, so Trisis was an incident back in 2017 where the Russian state adversaries, Sandworm, that we've been talking about a lot, that they had broken into the network of a petrochemical facility and had taken control over the entire OT network, including the safety instrumented systems. They had made one small programming error in the malicious firmware that they uploaded to that safety controller, which caused the safety controller to trip. And that once it tripped, the operator said, "Oop, something's happening, let's call in the vendor." Vendor came in and said, "Whoa, this is beyond us. This looks like somebody has manipulated or made changes to the firmware. This is a security issue." And so they brought in folks from all over to actually find out what had actually gone on. And Rob Lee mentions, right, he's highlighted multiple times there were at least 12 different ways that the attackers could have used that controller to kill people in the facility. Thankfully, right, they have made that mistake, and some people actually think they made it on purpose because maybe the person developing the code didn't believe in the mission of the Russian government. But regardless, we fast forward to 2024, where there was actually an explosion at a petrochemical facility in the United States. And Rob had mentioned that Dragos had been tracking Sandworm, the same group from Trisis back in 2017, and that's responsible for all these other OT-based attacks like the Ukrainian blackouts. Same group was continually trying to get into this petrochemical facility for 4, 5, 6 weeks over the internet, and all of a sudden there's an explosion. And the CEO publicly announced that the reason that there was explosion was the safety controller tripped, which is really eerily similar to the 2017 Trisis incident. Now, it's circumstantial evidence, and the CEO came out and said, well, there's no sign of a cyber attack. One thing to think about, or that you should be aware of, is that OT network at that petrochemical facility wasn't doing any type of security monitoring. So they wouldn't know if it was a cyber attack or not. But for the CEO to come out and say, yeah, this explosion happened because the safety controller tripped. Well, that's what happened back in Trisis in 2017. We just were lucky that there was no explosion at that time. We're here, there was. But we don't know if it was or not. Again, it's a lot of circumstantial information, but it's definitely a big what if. But again, at the end of the day, it's one of those things that it speaks to the fact that we make it too easy for attackers to get into OT environments and have some type of impact. Because we're not even doing the basics, the fundamentals. Because we can nail those 5 basic controls and vastly, greatly reduce the chance an attacker can get in the environment and have some type of impact. So when we talk about low impact, high impact, going back to state adversaries aligning with hacktivists, right? Or even in this case, where maybe what if it was sandworm trying to get into the environment and they finally were able to find a way in? Again, whether it's Russia, China, the United States, I don't care. I just want you gone. Right? If you're not on the network, there's no impact. There's no explosion, or the plant doesn't shut down. So at the end of the day, why does it matter? Right? Who's attacking? I always lean more towards, as an incident responder or defender, I don't care. I just want you off the network. So I appreciate it. If you made it this far, thanks for watching. Definitely, here's where you can find me. Obviously, you know where the YouTube channel is. And if you like the session, please go ahead and like the video, subscribe to the channel if you aren't. And I'll go ahead and see you in the next video.